Welcome to another episode of Whiskey Neat, spirited conversations with interesting people. I'm your host, Kristopher Hart, and today is a not insightful, incendiary, very, very exciting episode to say the least. There has been a long-standing issue in Texas when it comes to Texas whiskey, and a new secret organization has been formed to combat this, and it's something that's been a long time coming that I just think is a phenomenal idea, not for any other reason, but to simply state that what its members are, or what their products represent, is truly grain to glass, but more importantly, transparent whiskey. Someone that is just honest. We've talked about this at length many times on the show with Wade, who is one of the guests today. But there's been a long time issue in spirits where, whether on purpose, through deceit, or just by accident, that there's been some misleading information on the label of what you're buying. And there have been advocacy groups and organizations that have been fighting that battle to make sure that what you, as the average consumer or the experienced consumer, or honestly, many times, more importantly, the new consumer, when you see something on the shelf, that it be as honest and transparent as possible. So today's episode is a bit breaking. This is the first press, right? Yeah, this is the first press with the newly formed Texas Whiskey Association. Now, we've had Mark Schilling on the show, who helped form the Texas Distilled Spirits Association, and we've talked about this in length. And this newly formed organization is an organization that simply wants to make sure that those brands out there that have been through their process are held accountable to the highest form for their whiskey. And the Texas Whiskey Association is doing just that. So this is the first media interview with the compliance officer, Wade. He got scared out of retirement, and he's being as helpful as possible in making sure that what's out there is honest and transparent. And Spencer Whelan, the executive director. And what they're doing is they've got together with what you're seeing in front of you: Balcones, Garrison Brothers, Ranger Creek, Treaty Oak, Iron Roots, all big. I mean, a lot of them have been on the show already. These people are grain to glass and transparent, and they are, honest to God, just true, hardworking products of Texas distillers. So it's something that I'm proud of. I'm happy to have them on, and Spencer and Wade are on today to talk about just that. So you guys are going to be getting an extra episode next week, in which, by the time you're hearing this, I should say this week. So I'm super excited about it. I'm happy to talk to them about it, and you guys are going to get the scoop as to what's happening in Texas, and it's something I'm very proud of. So cheers, guys. Without further ado, Wade Woodard and Spencer Whelan from the newly formed Texas Whiskey Association. So I'm going to go ahead and roll my sleeves up for this one, because I feel like this episode is going to be an interesting one.
I agree.
I am excited that you're both here. I'm excited. Wade has been very tame the last couple times he's been on. I'm excited. I'm excited to get to a real issue in the market, a real solution that's being proposed. No one listening to this was expecting this, so let's jump right into it.
Absolutely.
There is a ongoing, and we've talked about this on the show quite a bit, and I'm going to cover it again in the introduction, but there's been an ongoing battle with transparency and honesty, and more important, oftentimes flat out deceitful labeling practices in the world of Texas whiskey in particular. Brands that make you think that what they're doing is Texas, so you want to support it, that good old Texas pride that we all have, where we love to support the Alamo and Davy Crockett and on the whole nine yards. The entire picture of whiskey in Texas has been built on the pride that Texans feel about their state. And there is can I say secret? Is it not? It's not going to be a secret
anymore.
By the time this airs, it won't be a secret anymore. But there's been an organization that has developed over the past few months.
Probably 6 months.
6 months.
Yeah.
It's
6
taken
months.
that
I mean,
much to
like
really
the
bring it to
formational stage is
formation.
really 6 months.
Well,
but
I mean, if you're going to
5-year
do
history, 6-month formation period.
if you're going to do something, you got to do it right.
That's right.
And it may take some time. So, essentially, a bunch of grain to glass distilleries in Texas have decided to, and again, it's not so. What was your tagline that we just said?
Well, I was saying this is not so much about sourcing as it is transparency,
right?
And as it is about telling the truth. So, the tagline that we're kind of using right now is "Taste the Truth," because these representatives,
It's a good tagline.
These representatives are really, really doing something true. Every single one of them, they have from the beginning, and on all of their products, they care about and they respect the consumer, and they respect the intelligence of the consumer. They expect them to know what they're talking about when they're picking out a whiskey, and they obviously know what they're talking about when they make it. So this is about elevating the makers of true Texas whiskey.
So, with that being said, the organization has formed to kind of not combat, but just add another level of real merit. So,
And the organization is Texas Whiskey Association.
I was getting there, wait.
Okay, we haven't mentioned it. We're talking for a few minutes yet.
Yeah. I mean, it is a podcast. We do a lot of talking. So the Texas, say that again.
Texas Whiskey Association.
Texas Whiskey Association. And this association will be a new association that's merely trying to put their brand on real, transparent Texas whiskey. Is that a fair enough assumption?
Yeah, it's going to be the words that I'm using to describe it more than anything is that we want to be the standard bearers for what a Texas whiskey is.
So, and I'm gonna throw in my very in jest jab at you right now. You guys are deciding to break the news at Whiskeys of the World.
That is correct.
Instead of a real Texas event that was started here by a Texas. Okay, I just curious. I want to make sure that
as I mentioned earlier, it took 6 months to form. I don't think any of us think it was going to take that long.
Right.
I would have liked to have broke the news.
I couldn't
at
agree
your
more.
show, but
I'm just kidding.
Timing didn't work.
I'm totally kidding. I've known for quite some time that you guys were forming this. I had talked to a few of your founding members and thought it was a great idea. There's several reasons why someone might be deceitful on a label, right? So it's either purposely they're lying to purposely play on your pride,
That's right.
or they're doing it unintentionally but out of a place of ignorance, and ignorance being merely not knowing better or not doing enough to make it clear, right? So they're oblivious to how it might come across to the consumer.
That's right.
And in my opinion, and I know it's your opinion as well, both are not okay.
Yes.
So you want you don't want a consumer being confused or duped, and you have an obligation as a brand to make sure that there's no confusion over what they're buying, because, I mean, as you've seen in some online forums, someone will post a photo, look at my Texas haul for the day or something, and 4 out of the 5 are not really from Texas.
Yep.
So the goal here is really just to have, and correct me if I'm wrong, distilleries that do produce grain to glass, but also if they don't produce grain to glass, like if they have another product that's maybe sourced, that they're not any way deceitful or lying or confusing on the label.
Yep.
And that's correct. One of our founding members is Treaty Oak Distilling, and they can make a product called Red-Handed Bourbon. The whole name implies the fact that it's sourced. And again, going back to, we have no issues with the company that chooses to source whiskey. We just don't want to have that product, if it's fermented and distilled and aged out of state, to bring it here in Texas and try to call it Texas whiskey. On their Red-Handed product, they have never tried to indicate that it was Texas whiskey. They were always clear that it was a sourced whiskey from out of state. And they're one of our founding members. And now they're making, and have been making for several years now, their own distillate, which now they're bottling and selling, which we have here today.
Ghost Hill Bourbon.
I'm excited to try it. I know I ran into them a couple years ago. The Texas Monthly event did a similar event in October. That was, at the time, all they had was sourced, but he had a bottle unmarked of their distillate. He's like,
Yep.
we actually have something you can taste here. And any company in Texas, the more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. I know Houston's got a bunch of distilleries in the works. I mean, I would argue that within the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see a good 20 new distilleries pop up in Texas.
And this is a good point for us. We're starting with 8 founding members,
right.
but we want to be a very open organization for these other companies as they start making Texas whiskey to welcome them into this organization.
That's right. 100%. I mean, there's no reason why somebody shouldn't be able to come in through the front door, however they want to get into this organization, to start following the standards that we're going to be laying out. This is not about dividing ourselves from the rest of the state and the rest of the distilleries. It's hard. It's really hard work to start a distillery. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of upfront capital.
A lot of time.
It's a lot of time. It's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And you don't know if you're going to make a dollar for years in most cases. So
imagine pitching that to your investors too.
Exactly.
Like, hey, it'll be a good 5 years before you see any of this back.
That's right. So, I mean, sourcing is a very logical and practical solution to that problem. It's a question of how you market what you're sourcing.
Sure.
You know.
So you said 8 founding members. Who are the 8 founding members?
Going alphabetically, no particular order other than alphabetical. Starting with Andalusia whiskey, which is run by head distiller Ty Phelps. Ty has a long history in the beer world with North by Northwest. He was the brewmaster at North by Northwest. Then he moved to Real Ale Brewing Company and started Real Spirits, which is kind of seen here. And then a couple of years ago, in fact, I think this Saturday, the 22nd, is their second anniversary at Andalusia. And they're producing some amazing stuff. Balcones, of course, celebrating their 10-year anniversary coming up pretty soon, next month.
Iconic,
Yeah, iconic brand. Crowded Barrel with many of these followers and many of your viewers probably know them as the Whiskey Tribe and the Whiskey Vault guys.
I'm interested to meet him at some point.
Yes.
Yeah. They seem like a good crew.
Yeah. So, as you know, that story is they had a channel first. They became popular. They have a distillery now that is funded by the people that follow them. And Crowded Barrel literally means we are crowdsourcing. We're taking information from our fans and we're making products based on what they tell us.
Sure.
So it's a really interesting experiment. It's a really interesting product, and they're on with the founders. Garrison Brothers, of course, another iconic brand, along with Balcones, that kind of kicked this whole thing off 10 years ago. So Dan Garrison, we've all had amazing conversations, and I've
seen several panels of him voicing his opinion on these.
Yeah.
So-called Texas distillers.
Yeah, and look, I mean, there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of, as we said, hard work that goes into this, and there's a lot of passion, right?
I'd love to get him on.
One of our challenges of putting this organization together is these guys are all competitors, and I know Dan is really. So for him to say, okay, we need to elevate Texas whiskey as
we'll
a
work
category,
on this together, even though we're competitors.
Yeah, and that was maybe him swallowing a little bit of his pride.
Yeah.
But I think it's in the long term, it's going to be very beneficial to him.
Sure.
I mean, this is a team of rivals. These guys are fierce rivals against each other. But there is a greater cause here. It's kind of like the NFL and NFL and the AFL joining forces at one point. They're rivals, but there are some set of standards. We're still playing football, right?
Yeah.
So we're still making whiskey, and we're trying to do it the right way. So Garrison is on board. Iron Root Republic up in Denison.
Of course. We've talked about, and he's actually a legitimate listener to the show. So Robert, and he was paramount to us introducing, meeting each other. So shout out to Iron Root.
And actually, I'll go down the list a little bit, but Robert will be our secretary of the association. Ranger Creek in San Antonio.
I've had him on the show, Dennis Rylander. Yeah.
So obviously they have a brewery and a distillery.
He was also himself was sourced. He's not from Texas.
That's right. He was what we call I guess a matured Texan, if you want to look at it that way.
He was aged here for sure.
That's right. And still Austin, which is relatively new. Obviously, they even have their new make right here. Actually does touch a barrel, so they're according to the classification.
That's bourbon.
That is whiskey.
But you said touch the barrel, right?
Yeah.
So
it's a new make, but it's
okay. Why is it not bourbon though? Remember that whole conversation about age requirements?
I think it's a decision.
Wasn't necessarily a new barrel.
It's very doubtful that it was probably a new barrel.
Oh, okay.
Could be a used
We've
barrel,
talked about that before. I wish that someone would produce.
I shouldn't speak on their behalf on that, but
right.
Yeah,
we've talked about that before. I wish someone would produce a non-age stated whiskey that was an age.
Yeah.
Like, because you can't have something on the label that falsely identifies it, but you can put something on the label that makes it even more vague. So you could call something a whiskey if it was a bourbon. You could call something, right?
Yeah,
Am I wrong?
It's that TTB class and type stuff that gets a little fuzzy.
Technically, you're supposed to label your product to the most appropriate class type. And there is a line in the TTB CFRs to that effect.
Okay, but
there are certain whiskeys that they can be kind of both class types, and it gets confusing, but off topic.
Can I distill, but put produced by on the label? Like, I don't have to put distilled by. That is a clear indication of. I know we're going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, you're about to get into CFR codes.
It's something that Wade and I have played around with quite a bit, and it's clear why that you are the. Would you say the head of compliance, the compliance director?
That's going to be my role within the organization. I basically had talked to Dan when he was trying to get some of this going, and told him I would like to be involved in it in any way possible. And kind of the natural role came about to me because what have I been known about as calling out TTB labeling?
You've been known for a few things, but that's definitely the one.
Well, label compliance
and
issues with compliance. So I think it was a pretty natural fit in this organization for me to fall into that role.
Yeah.
And then last
Treaty Oak, which we've discussed, and they're doing a lot of really fun things. Just outside of Austin and Dripping Springs.
Sure.
Great ranch. That's the other thing. All these places have an amazing tour experience, and that's a big part of this too. Is people need to see what
this is about,
what the process is. This is about people who are following the process appropriately, and a
lot of these places are touristy destinations. There's a couple locally who couldn't be more involved in spirits, and they both make a trip every year up to Garrison Brothers.
That's right.
And they do that. They go up there when they do their bottling line, and I mean, Texas has such a deep and rich culture behind whiskey that I would say that it is about time that something was held to a higher standard. Not necessarily to naysay, but to just basically make a clear indication, a differentiation between real transparent, real honest, and those who may not meet the cut, but not as a way to tear them down, but as a way to basically make it clear that what you are drinking is transparent.
100%. We want to make this easy to consumers to be able to recognize a grain-to-glass Texas-made whiskey.
Yep.
That's something that you have been fighting a good battle with for several years now, at least on the Facebook forums, was just simply that, hey, here's a few tips that will let you know that what you're drinking really isn't from Texas. And if it doesn't have these things that they're supposed to have, then they're not only they're wrong, but whether they intentionally do it or not, they're lying to you. And it's something that is something that, like you said, Wade's known for. So you being the head of compliance is a perfect fit. So, because I know there's some distillers in Texas that have actually consulted with you before and have reached out to you and said, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?
I've had several people from Whelan Nation actually will you take a look at my label before I submit it?
Will you pick it apart for me? Yeah.
Well, I'll pick it apart. I'm glad to. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's great. I mean, you were retired, so does this officially count as you being out of retirement?
No, not according to my wife.
Okay.
I'm doing this on a voluntary basis anyhow. At least I said
I
would
sign
sign
passion
up
project
and do it for the first year on a volunteer basis. So, because I want to see these companies succeed. I want to see Texas whiskey elevated. So,
well, let's start off by pouring something from Texas. So,
sure.
I'm familiar with some of these brands. I'm surprised I have never tasted Andalusia. So we can start in alphabetical order.
Let's go with that. So this is Andalusia's triple distilled, so they're Irish style single malt.
Okay.
They're producing all single malts currently.
It smells fantastic. I mean,
that was a fast 15 minutes.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it flies by. You'd be surprised. We had
time flies when you're enjoying whiskey.
We had the Glenmorangie guys in here half an hour ago, and we went over they only brought 3 whiskeys with them, and you get into conversation, you get talking, you dig deeper. It's just like what you do at your house. I mean, I've come over to Wade's house to drop a bottle off and stuck around for 3 hours. So it's something that, it's what this is, in my opinion, it's what it's about, from at least the consumer side, right? I know that making it is like a passion and a dream, but from my side, just being able to sit with you guys and have a conversation about the things that we're passionate about is...
Well, I think that's the thing, right? What's interesting about this from Wade's perspective, like we were doing this in parallel for a long time. Wade was doing it with, his groups and Facebook, and I was working with some of the distilleries in the background.
We need to get back on the air before you do that.
We're on. Yeah, we're back.
Okay.
No, we're good.
It's an immediate. It's a quick break.
Okay.
It's a quick break.
It's immediate. Yeah.
Sorry.
Wade's been doing it. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. It's actually, I'm digging it. It's got not a weird, but like an interesting. It changes from the initial nose and sweetness to kind of like a roasted, malty note, and then on the back end, it's got kind of like a lingering finish. Where can I find that locally? I know we're interrupting, but where can we find it locally?
From a distribution perspective, I couldn't exactly tell you. I know that at least this particular release, I think mostly is going to be at the distillery initially, but I've started to see it on some shelves around Austin. So I don't.
They always get it first. I'm fighting the good battle, guys.
Yeah.
Austin and Dallas. I don't have any issue with you. There's no rivalry here, but it drives me nuts that it takes forever for Houston to get these releases. It seems like everyone gets them before. I mean, even Iron has this massive footprint in Dallas.
And I will say to the distributors out there that are listening, part of the goal of this organization, get these things distributed. Let people see these, let people taste them. It needs to be in more places. It's not just the big brands.
Sure.
There are some very big brands in here. There's a great assortment, right? We have some very big brands, high producers, brands that have been around for 10 years now, brands that have been around for 1 or 2, but all of them have quality standards that exceed, I'd say, 90% of the industry, right? These folks really care about what they're producing, and getting it to the people is going to be an important part, whether they come to the distillery or get it on the shelves.
So that poses a question, 2-part question. I'm going to ask, and if you don't like the way this is worded, we can reword it.
Sure.
Walk me through the criteria, and then how is the consumer going to know? Is there going to be some sort of indication? Is it going to be on websites?
Mm-hmm.
Is there going to be some sort of certification that will be apparent? Walk me through the criteria. What's required in order to be a part of
membership or part of the definitions?
Sure. I saw this from here, but it needs to be on camera. So I'd like, walk me through the requirements in order for someone, so that people know that if this has certified Texas whiskey, is it going to say certified Texas whiskey? And then what are the requirements?
We'll talk about that soon.
Okay.
Exactly what that is going to be. I can tell you the general definition of what a Texas whiskey is from our perspective.
Okay, that's a good way
of saying it. Let's just focus on those 2 words for now. Texas whiskey.
Okay.
Right. So, starting with grain. Okay. You can bring your grain in from other places. Obviously, barley, other places you need to
raw materials.
Yeah. But if you start from grain, ground grain flakes, then from there, the process is entirely done within the state of Texas. So
distilling, mashing,
fermenting,
aging,
distilling, maturing, bottling.
That's all really made here. Yeah.
Within a DSP that is wholly located within the state of Texas.
DSP, for the few that may not.
Distilled spirits plant.
It's essentially a permit that you have from the federal government that says you can distill. So every distillery in Kentucky has a DSP number. Every distillery in the U.S. has a DSP number. So essentially, a Texas distillery that processes it from start to finish.
Yep.
What we like to say, grain to glass.
Yes.
That is a Texas whiskey.
That is a Texas. So, and that also means the addition of no other spirits from an outside of Texas source.
Okay. So that brings.
So say you're 90% in state and you put in 10% of something else. It's not a Texas whiskey.
That brings to mind a few brands. I won't say names, but essentially okay. So blending off your product, your Texas product with out-of-state product no longer makes it okay.
Yep.
Okay. I'm with you.
But let's say there were several brands in Texas that wanted to do a blend together. Is that a Texas whiskey? Well, as long as all those elemental parts are done grain to glass within Texas, then yes.
Okay.
That's a Texas whiskey too.
what are your requirements? So in my mind, I'm imagining someone says, hey, Spencer,
Yep.
I'd like to become part of the organization. And they submit their application. And then I imagine it goes to Wade's desk and Wade says, okay, let me review their labels.
He's really good at this.
It's a little more than that. We're going to review their whole process at a distillery visit to see what they're going through an on-site visit. But yes, label reviews and those kind of things. One thing I want to mention about our standards, what we are calling Texas whiskey, is actually following the federal guidelines.
That's exactly correct.
For a Texas whiskey too. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're taking already established.
You're not imagining up your own standards. These are standards that are already established that aren't always enforced.
This is not like the Lincoln County process in Tennessee where it's like, oh, this is a thing that the federal government doesn't recognize. These are all federal rules.
These are federal rules at both the TTB level and at the Texas TABC level for whiskeys. TABC basically copies TTB CFR. So we're not reinventing anything. We're just saying this is what Texas whiskey is according to the standards.
Let's discuss the TTB for a minute. And this may or may not have been discussed on the show, but essentially what a lot of consumers seem to not know, it's not their fault. But the process for producing a product in the U.S. essentially is you submit the label of what you want to put on the bottle to the TTB, the Tax and Trade Bureau, right? The Tax and Trade Bureau. Yeah, Tax and Trade Bureau. They have an agent that will review somewhat hastily at times the label versus what the rules are. Now, it's quite common to kind of submit something from when I say ignorance, and I'm just going to say this one more time. Yeah. When I say ignorance, I mean merely of a place of not knowing any better, not always an assumption of deceit.
Sins of omission versus sins of action.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what happens is someone in an organization who wants to produce a whiskey will submit that label. There could be something wrong with the label, and it goes unnoticed by the TTB agent. It gets approved, and then it goes out into production. And the ultimate person that falls victim to this is the consumer. And you have people who will go out and approach the distillers and say, hey, just so you know, what you did was actually illegal. This needs to be fixed. And oftentimes their stance is, well, if it was approved, it wouldn't have been approved if it wasn't legal. And this is a big complaint that a lot of people in the whiskey world have, because the assumption is that if it was approved, it was compliant, and that's not always the case. Right. So the way that TTB is structured is you take an oath of...
it's a perjury. You're basically saying that this label complies with all federal standards under perjury requirements. So you make a signed statement under oath when you turn in a label that it meets all federal requirements.
Sure. Even if it doesn't, and even if you think it does and it doesn't, you are technically breaking the law and you're committing perjury. And what happens is they have an option for that. You can surrender the label and say, hey, look, we messed up. Diageo did this last year with their bourbon mash, where they actually surrendered the label to the TTB and said, look, hey, the application we submitted was actually wrong. I am sorry. Here, take this back. We're going to change it. And but up until this point, there's no real enforcement.
Well, working it back around to our organization. Yeah. What I see sometimes online, Chris, is, I'll point something out and people say, well, what's going to be done about it? And that becomes a difficult point. But with this organization, we are doing something about it because we're having a criteria set up within our organization for Texas whiskey. So if a customer knows our organization, they may not necessarily trust everything the TTB is doing, but I hope they can trust what we're doing as a Texas Whiskey Association.
And there's precedent for this, right? I mean, federal agencies fall down on the job a lot, and it's not necessarily their fault in all cases, right? There's staffing requirements. Everything that can go wrong within any organization can also go wrong at the federal government. In fact, many people say it happens more. But that doesn't prevent people who know the industry the best these members
Sure.
who are committed to doing it the right way and holding it to the highest standards of the letter
Well,
of
their
the law.
livelihood's on the line.
Exactly.
So
these people are following those standards to the strictest interpretation, and that's what we're doing. Is we're saying take the strictest
making it
interpretation,
official.
and we're saying we're going to make it official as an association, and bring that standard up so that the consumer is not the one left holding the bag. We're both consumers. We are not distillers, right? The staff of this organization right now is consumer driven, and we want this whole thing to be consumer driven too, like part of the public. So I think it's really important to say that this is actually a conversation that's happening between distilleries, producers, makers, and the public, and respecting each other in that regard. And it's not a purely legislative agenda. It's not a purely regulatory agenda. This is an agenda about getting truth to the public and making great whiskey that is telling the truth.
I want to try. I didn't know this was coming out, and
Yeah.
I talked to Winston a lot. I thought, but you're a jerk for not telling me. I know he's listening.
Here, Winston.
Texas High Rye.
Iribe Bourbon.
Yeah. So
It's their September release and part of, I guess, Bourbon Heritage Month. So they released both the Texas Blue Corn along with the High Rye. So I think it's 39% rye into the mash bill.
that's a lot on the secondary grain,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, absolutely. By the way, the Andalusia I thought was incredibly pleasant. I wasn't. You never know what to
That's good
expect.
right now,
Texas
thanks.
is such a wide spectrum of spirits, and it was very, very enjoyable.
Yes.
So this has some of that chocolate rye malt into
Chocolate
it?
malt, yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Boy, you could really pick up on the chocolate in their
Mhm.
rye whiskey.
And there's a butteriness to it that you don't get in many bourbons, if any, that I could name off the top of my head.
Oof, robust.
And that was
It's that Balcones thumbprint, right?
Is that
Oh,
a
yeah.
Every single
straight
time.
version there? That you
Yes,
have?
It's
that's
a-
62%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
62%.
I
It's
think
gonna
I got
hit you.
2 more chest hairs on that one.
Yeah. A
So-
drop of water will change. We tried it just the other day, and it will absolutely change it completely in a good way.
It's very pronounced. I very much enjoy that.
Yeah.
Speaking of balconies, what's the process for distilleries? So real quick, certified Texas whiskey criteria, produced licensed distillers, wholly my tongue's numb. It's at balconies, wholly located in the state of Texas, produced from grains and Texas sourced water, processed and distilled here, fermented here, barreled and bottled here, has to be compliant with all TTB regulations.
Yep.
So even if it's got a TTB approval on it, doesn't matter.
No.
If it's reviewed by the Texas Whiskey Association as being non-compliant, then it's out.
That's where Wade
Well,
will come
hopefully
in.
we'll be able to work with the producer to
Fix the problems.
fix the problem.
Yeah, not immediately
This is not-
blackball them. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, this
Yeah,
is
that's
not an exclusionary
Sure.
process. It's trying to be as inclusionary.
Let's try to better everybody, to raise the bar in a supportive way.
In fact, I can say this, in the conversations that we've had over the last 6 months, there have been producers that have been kind of that sin of omission or whatever, just weren't labeling
Sure.
properly or didn't have it proper on their website or whatever. And they've had conversations with our members who have been having these conversations with us to develop these standards. And in that time, things have already changed. We've already seen their website change, them announcing what portion of theirs was MGP or anything like that, where they were being transparent on their website. The labels are already printed, so they're kind of got to get through those. But kind of like the bourbon mash, the Crown
Sure.
bourbon mash, right? They're allowed to keep doing it, but their intent from this point forward is to start
To
doing
be honest,
it the right way,
transparent.
and that is exactly what we want from this. We want them to, whether it's error of omission or a different marketing scheme or whatever it was in the past, to start making this the standard and coming to this standard rather than using this standard to divide the distilled spirits industry in Texas.
The last requirement, which I didn't mention, was the independently verified via on-site annual inspection by an officer of the Texas Whiskey Association compliance program to make sure that those standards are being met. So I guess my question is there some apprehension or some nervousness, just as a point of raw conversation here, that this is going to ruffle some feathers, piss off a few people? I mean, do you think that, because like, for instance, just as a human, I've done stuff that wasn't meant to upset people.
Yeah.
And then later I'm like, oh, I could see how that might have been upsetting.
Yeah.
Are you guys nervous that there's going to be some pushback at all?
Look, if there's going to be, I think about it this way: if the speed limit changes on your favorite road from 55 to 35 for whatever reason, right? It was not safe. It wasn't good for the general public, and the speed limit changed, and people got really, really mad about it because they want to do it the way they were doing it. 10 miles
faster, sure.
Then any ruffled feathers or anger is entirely on the side of the person who feels offended, not the person who's setting the standard. If we're trying to set a standard that is better, above, beyond, better for the consumer, better for quality, better for everybody,
raise the bar.
Raise that bar all the way up to a level that is achievable and compliant
and
with
reasonable.
Everything, and reasonable, then no offense, but if that offends you, then sorry.
Sure.
That's more on you than it is on the people who are trying to raise the bar.
So I asked that question because I'm curious as to, and I'm sure someone might have already thought about this far into the show. How is this any different than the TDSA, the Texas Distilled Spirits Association, or what are you doing differently or changing or in honor of, or you know what I mean? What's the?
So I'll answer quickly. I'll let Wade chime in on this as well. But like, I'd say the core thing is all of these, almost every member, if not every member, is a TDSA member as well.
Sure.
Right. There is the distilled spirits industry, and then there is whiskey. It's a different animal. It's an entirely different animal.
So maybe a more strict subset. Is that like the difference between bourbon and straight bourbon?
I mean, if you look at if you compare a vodka and a whiskey, yes, they're both distilled spirits over 40% alcohol, but that's kind of where the comparisons stop.
Yeah.
Right. So the business model is different. The amount of time that you have to mature to the raw materials of cooperage.
Gin and vodka can be made, distilled, and sold the next day.
That's right.
You can't do that with whiskey for the most part. It has to be properly aged. So
yes.
There's a subset. We have some members like Balcones. One of my favorite products from them is the Rumble.
It's hands down my favorite product from them.
Especially Rumble cask strength.
But that's what I'm referring to. For the record, we're talking about RCR. We're talking about RCR.
Yeah. That product is not a whiskey. Okay? It's a...
By definition.
By definition, because it's not made from grains. It's made from Texas figs and Texas honey and turbinado sugar, all great things.
100% great things.
But it's not a whiskey.
It's the most whiskey, non-whiskey I've ever had.
So they're a founding member, and their whiskey bottles will be part of the program, but the Rumble
will not be a Texas whiskey.
That's not a Texas whiskey, never will be. So
yeah.
It's okay, so we're talking specific
but
to
getting
whiskey
back,
only.
To TDSA, I didn't really answer that.
Yes.
As you mentioned, we're not trying to be a competitor to the TDSA. The TDSA has done wonderful things for the industry here in Texas.
Absolutely.
You would not be able to buy bottles at the distilleries today if it wasn't for the efforts of the TDSA lobbying.
That's correct.
So they have really helped out all these small distilleries getting started. So we give them a ton of credit. We hope all our members continue to be TDSA members, and if they're not TDSA members, to join the TDSA. So we're not trying to take away from their agenda.
Sure.
But we just have a different agenda that's focused on whiskey.
Yeah.
Okay, so just
the Venn diagrams
they overlap.
They overlap a lot.
Sure.
And if there's anywhere where it doesn't overlap, it's going to be related strictly to whiskey.
Sure.
And I can foresee no immediate conflict that would happen in regards to that. So if anything, we want to complement what they're doing.
I mean, that's a perfect way of saying it. So essentially, I can't help but make the comparison to straight bourbon or Tennessee whiskey.
Yep.
Just that it's a subset, that there's some overlap, but it's just you essentially saw a lacking hole in enforcement in some way, and you want to basically hold that to a higher standard and different. I mean, would you say that it's an ultimate goal of yours to maybe have Texas law the way Tennessee did in 2011 and define Texas Texas whiskey? I'm telling you that 62%.
Getting wiggy with it here.
I think that might be a very long-term goal of the
I
association.
bet you could do that by 2020. I mean, once you guys are established, there's enough support for Texas that I bet it would take one phone call to a senator.
You know what that's going to take, though? It's going to take consumers being educated about
That's
the
it.
product. And so that's our initial goal, is to have consumers on board. And if consumers on board, then the Texas legislator is going to see that and be more reactive as compared to some association going to them trying to push it.
Trying to push
we
a
need,
lobbyist.
We need to have it pushed from the consumer level up. So that's our first step, is consumer education.
Wouldn't that, now let me ask you this just as a theory, would that, if you did push it and you guys were actually responsible for, because again, with the way the TTP is structured and the way that they enforce things, if you guys as a whole lobbying to make that a defined Texas requirement, wouldn't that also force all these other brands who are operating their own way? That, because essentially what you're doing is if it meets your standards, then it is a Texas whiskey certified Texas whiskey by the Texas Whiskey Association. It doesn't necessarily prevent those who are continually operating under their current format.
Right.
Knowing you, I could see you lobbying to make this a state law. Would that be a goal? Has that been talked?
Well, let me put it this way. What Wade said is exactly right. This is going to be driven from the consumers upward, right? This is not going to be driven, at least in the near term. There are zero plans for a legislative agenda this upcoming session, other than to maybe support some of the same things that TDSA is doing.
Sure.
Working with the same objectives that everybody has together. Of course, we're going to be aware of what's happening at the Texas legislature. This is the TABC sunset year. There's a lot of things going on related to all distilled spirits and all alcohol laws in the state of Texas. So all of those things are on the table this year, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily have an agenda other than to inform the public. And
Sure.
If the public comes to the table and says, these are the things that matter to us, then of course we're gonna help support that. But it's going to be driven by public demand, in the same way that I think this organization was founded by people like Wade, people like myself, who are like, this is not correct. We need to find a way to make sure that the people who are doing it right are elevated. And if that means elevating laws, then that's another discussion. But your question about TTP is usually a follower of standards rather than the creator of standards, right? They follow the Scotch Whisky Association's rules for Scotch, right? They follow international trade law on those things. So they will define in their CFRs what Scotch is based on Scotch Whisky Association rules, right? You can't call it Scotch unless it meets those standards.
Sure.
Right. So I think there's a lot of Tennessee whiskey is kind of going through the same thing. They have a law that was passed at the state level of what Tennessee whiskey is, and now you'll see it entering into the trade discussions happening between U.S. and Mexico NAFTA discussions.
Sure.
They're using the word Tennessee whiskey.
It's being brought up a lot, actually.
Yes, it is.
Thanks to Jack Daniels.
Yes, it is. But
sponsor of the show, by the way.
Yeah, but the point is that words matter, standards matter.
Sure.
And law usually follows the standards, and we're trying to create standards along with consumer input, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Well, it's something that I've applauded you for years. We've recently connected.
Yes.
I'm excited to. I know where Wade got in on this. How did you guys? How did this start? Like, are you the driving force that kind of pulled this all together? I mean,
I don't want to say. I had an idea, right? I had an idea of what I thought this was. I have a background in public affairs, marketing, communications, grassroots mobilization, fundraising. That's kind of my world. And I saw that there was a gap in the market. I also saw that there were people who were filling that gap with branding and marketing that I didn't think was genuine. And I could see that it was going to be a problem. So I presented it way long time ago, like I said, 5 years and then 3.5 years ago. And it was not an idea whose time had come. It wasn't ready yet.
It wasn't ready yet.
It wasn't ready yet.
Ahead of its time.
Yeah. that sounds arrogant, but it was, I was not correct at that time that this is something that was needed. It is needed now, and everybody is behind it. And the fact that we got 8 massively powerful competitors working together on a common set of standards is almost a miracle, right? I mean, Balcones and Garrison are on the same page on what defines a Texas whiskey and what we need to do together.
One thing was challenging about getting these together is some of them are completely different in size. Andalusia is, one of the younger ones and just getting started as compared to Garrison and Balcones. And so to get all these guys and coming up with a structure. And girls.
Still awesome.
Yes. And to come up with a structure for founding members that they could all agree to was really kind of quite complicated. And Spencer is the one that kind of financed that whole.
Yeah.
He was very good at.
A lot of absolutely not. And then okay, so he says we should add this to it. And
yeah, a lot of like I played Switzerland a lot of one-on-one conversations. All of them are legitimate points, though. I mean, everybody has their exact reasons for saying what they're saying. I joke on email about it, but this is not herding cats, it's herding alpha dogs, right?
Oh, sure.
Right. So
herding,
yeah,
like HERD, not herding,
not hurting, but herding alpha dogs, because there's a lot of really, frankly, validated egos in the room that say, yeah, this is the way we did it. We're the leaders in this, and if Texas whiskey has a name, it's because of us. Not because of an association that we're trying to build. It's because of the intrinsic quality of the product. And getting these standards together, and it actually, in this political climate that we live in now, it's actually kind of encouraging to me that we can come to agreement on. So
you guys solved it in 6 months, whereas
5 years and then 6 months of hard negotiation.
Yeah.
Okay,
right,
so
right.
let's pour it on.
We determined that you like barrel proof whiskey, so.
Oh, y'all had this discussion? There was a discussion. I hate you.
So here's some Garrison Cowboy bourbon that they're releasing this month. I believe their next round.
The new round, yes.
I like all whiskey. Good whiskey's good whiskey. There's no complaints. In fact, we had Glenmorangie on just, I said an hour ago, and 46%. I'm down. It's good whiskey's good whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you this though. So I know that they had changed their process a few years ago, and Wade has told me about it. And it's so much more. I feel like this batch is the best batch yet. I feel like
on their regular release product, the 2018, and it has 2018 right out on front of the bottle. I do think it's their best normal release.
Well, it's like anything else. You support a small grain-to-glass distillery and hope that as time goes on, they flourish. And Garrison Brothers has grown so much in a substantial way over the past few years that it's really just nice to see how far they've come.
Yeah, and you got to give Dan and his team a lot of credit for.
I don't think Dan will watch this, but Dan, I want you on my show, man. I want you on the show.
We're working on that, Dan.
With Wade, just so I can.
But you got to give him a lot of credit for leading the charge for 10 years on what is Texas whiskey. I
haven't been up to high yet, but I hear it's one of the most gorgeous.
It is an absolutely beautiful tour.
It's like a massive farm almost.
By the way, if I can't get Dan on the show, I'll talk to Donis. I might be able to get Donis, a master distiller, to come on.
Okay.
Yep. I think he'd probably be more open to it. So.
Sure. I enjoy. I talk about Mike Salopek and his wife Jessica quite a bit, but they do, where the whole community comes and they bottle it together, and it just seems like such a good family-oriented place to visit. I'm a huge fan, and you were actually the one who introduced me to Garrison's, and I met Dan years ago at a Specs tasting. So I love how far they've come. It's tremendous. Yeah,
it's an amazing. I think that's an important part of this too. We're talking about forming the governing organization. We're talking about what defines Texas whiskey. We're also going to be talking about how to engage people in what, frankly, is the fun of Texas whiskey, right? Visiting the distilleries, being there, being part of the culture, to build a better whiskey culture in Texas. I mean, it's an enjoyable thing. It should not be a fight. It should not be a big, argument between people. Sure. You can have differences of opinion, but you all come together around a glass and have some fun and go see some bands and enjoy a day out at a distillery.
So speaking of a fight, that it's obviously not meant to be that way, But what's the, again, going back to what's the difference between what you guys are doing and let's say the Go Texan logo?
Okay.
So historically, the average consumer sees Go Texan logo on a bottle.
Yep.
And I'd say out of, 100 of the average consumer, maybe 80 of them really recognize it. Mm-hmm. And what they think of it is it's a Texas product. Now, if you carry the Go Texan logo, which we've talked about on the show quite a bit, there are no real standards for it having the logo for whiskey as opposed to, let's say, wine.
Yeah.
Right? So wine, I think there's a requirement for how many grapes.
Wine is probably about 3 years ago, they changed the requirement that 80% of the grapes have to be grown in Texas to carry the Go Texan logo. But that was a multi-year fight even to get that in place. Whiskey, and I've talked to the Go Texan people about this before, as long as some part of the process occurs here in Texas, they consider that enough to have the Go Texan logo on that. And so we look at it from our standards of what a Texas whiskey is, and just having some part of the process is not enough that we think it should be called a Texas whiskey. So
it hadn't been on the radar until now, right? So like for years, if you've been in the industry, we've known Texas whiskey, but for them, I think their big focus has been other realms of the, like the wine thing was a big push. It hasn't been enough of a concern for them to create standards around it. So I can see.
I mean, that's right. They're not a whiskey standards body. They're
right.
not.
They have so many different types of categories, artisan products. It's all over. I mean, it's such a broad mark in terms of terms of governance and standard setting that it's not just food products. There's a lot of things that can go into that. So again, kind of like we were talking about with TDSA a little bit, whiskey's a different thing, right?
It needs to be treated as such.
Exactly. It's, I like to refer it as kind of the big leagues of distilling. It's if you know how to brew, you know how to distill, well, then you got to take it those last few steps and do all of those things plus more and longer. And the business model takes longer to recover your funds.
Sure.
It's a different thing. It's a different animal. And what we're trying to do is reflect the standards that are appropriate to that difference.
So is there, okay. All right. Sorry, I'm trying to be careful about how I'm posing certain questions. So you guys are wanting to create, enforce a standard of your own. Garrison, Iron Root, all these guys. Does Iron Root carry the Go Texan logo?
Might be on the side of the back. I'm not positive.
Yeah, and I think that's where the problem lies. Is you have someone who if they see an Iron Root bottle on the shelf, they know that is grain of glass Texas.
That's right.
But they assume if they see the next one on the shelf that isn't,
that's
that
part
it's
of the problem.
Still okay. So, all right. So
again, and this isn't a problem that I think is Go Texan's fault. It's a problem that exists regardless, right?
Sure.
So
that's where that assumption of innocence comes from. Is where there are some people who are doing it out of a strict, deceitful way. There were some that are just simply doing it by accident, but either way is not okay.
Yeah.
So you're wanting to provide some standards for Texas that I think is a great first step in potentially downline maybe legislature.
Right.
So I think it's fantastic.
To be clear, we're not defining whiskey here. We're defining Texas whiskey.
100%.
And that's a very specific thing, right? Kind of like, Angus beef. Angus Association of America doesn't define beef. It defines Angus beef and what's specific to that breed. And this is specific to this category as a state. Has a lot of different regions, a lot of different terroir potentials. It has so much potential growth that if we don't get on this now, then the brand will be diluted. No pun intended, but it will be diluted to the point where we need to know what a Texas whiskey is and nobody will believe it. Right. So
to summarize, why now? Because now is the perfect time.
It's just kind of the way the stars aligned, honestly. It's just the market and the players and everybody. And I've seen this in a lot of other industries too. About 10 years of an industry existing, everybody's kind of doing their own thing for 10 years, right? are we going to live? Are we going to make it? Are we going to go past the next quarter? Like everybody's too focused on what they have to do to make it through this.
To survive,
period. But after about a decade, it's like, okay, this is a thing. Now we're actually going to be an industry, not just a whole bunch of individual players. And when that happens, it's time to take it up to the next level, and that's to set standards.
Okay, so if someone has a Texas distillery out there and who didn't know about this, but is meeting these standards that we've outlined today, who do they need to approach? How do they need to reach out? And if you're just a consumer who wants to learn more about it, what's the name of the website?
So it will be texaswhiskey.org, spelled with an E. We'll also have the Y version, but it'll redirect. It'll redirect to the one with the E. So it'll be texaswhiskey.org, and that is where we'll host everything initially. Because we formed last week.
Sure.
So
it's been a long process.
It's been a long process. Yeah. So you're going to have to bear with us a little while we kind of get our marketing and branding legs underneath us. But the website will be there. There will be an option for people to sign up for newsletters, and then there will be a lot more announcements in the near future. Probably this quarter before the end of 2018. And then if somebody's out there and they want to become a member, they can contact me on the website. You'll see we'll also have links to our membership development team, and basically come to us, apply an application. We're going to create a membership committee within the founding members.
Sure.
Who will review all the applications, and then they'll kick it to the compliance committee, and the compliance committee will say, hey, wait, go check and make sure that they're going to meet the standards. Right?
Sure. So let's throw the website up here, right? I always love doing this right here. Boom. All right. This is the website. Go to this website. Will there be, I know it's a landing page initially, will there be some sort of initial way they can contact? Like, there will be some email address on the website that they can reach out?
There will be email addresses where they can reach out to myself and Wade and the team. I'll share, those will be on the website. And there will also be a way to sign up for the newsletters.
Sure.
And then we'll start passing out information that way.
Sounds good.
And other social media sites with the same
We'll be on Facebook. We'll be on Twitter and Instagram. All basically at TexasWhiskey.org.
TexasWhiskey.org.
Yep.
Well, guys, I'm honored you came. I'm so glad to meet you. I'm always glad to see you, Wade. I'm a big fan. I couldn't be more excited about this. So just to make sure that what we're doing is at the best possible transparent standards out there, and doing it your own way is just, I applaud you for it. So Spencer, thank you so much. Appreciate you guys coming on. Wade, always a pleasure, buddy. And guys, thank you so much. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.